So, our first speaker, who I actually haven't yet found on the screen, so I hope you're there somewhere, is Adele Yaron. And Adele is going to speak. Adele's paper is called "What's This Got to Do with Me? Grappling with Issues of Decolonisation Within a Psychotherapy Training Institute." So I'll hand over to you, Adele.
Great. Thank you so much. Yes, I'm here.
Ah,
Really here from the beginning. And thank you, Dale, for your very broad and deep introduction. So yeah, really, I'm building upon a lot of things that have already been mentioned this morning, and I will do my utmost to stick to my 15-minute time. So my name's Adele Yaron. I'm a psychotherapist and supervisor in private practice. And I'm also a trainer and the academic coordinator of the Curricula Institute in Bristol, which is a UKCP recognised psychotherapy training. So I wrote a paper, and the title of the paper is "What's This Got to Do with Me? Grappling with Issues of Decolonisation Within a Psychotherapy Training Institute." I wrote it in the first person. It's really about my own experiences, and it certainly isn't a polemic on some of these very complex and difficult issues. And I'm certainly still grappling. So I wrote this paper at a particular time that Dale mentioned, with the rise of populist political movements, and really what I see as a struggle within our regulatory bodies to offer a suitable framework for all to practice within. So there's ample evidence that psychotherapy students from racially minoritized groups feel excluded and their experience of racism often ignored. This research, we've known about this for a couple of decades. So really today, rather than use the term decolonisation, I ask very simply, what might make it possible to have a psychotherapy training that is by everyone and for everyone? And I use a couple of quotes on this short presentation from ancient biblical text, actually, from the Talmud. And this one really struck me, which is, "If I am not for others, what am I? If I am not for myself, who will be? And if not now, when?" Let's see if I can move this on. Yeah. So really, I had to do a lot of very hard and difficult thinking post October the 7th, 2023. I have Jewish heritage, and I realized having to really think about what was my relationship to the geopolitics of the region, particularly in relation to privilege and oppression. There is a history of seeing, for myself, as seeing Jews as victims and not perpetrators. And really, prior to October the 7th, 2023, I hadn't really acknowledged the fact that I actually occupy multiple positions. And it was Peter Beinart, who was someone I chose to follow, who has a Substack, which I really recommend, and also a book which he wrote back in the beginning of the year called "Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza." And it's really my personal experience with having to look through a very different lens, which I'm hoping might offer up opportunities for reflection at the systemic level of the psychotherapy profession. And I use a term that both Feluke Taylor and Robert Downes use in their project Otherwise, about unlearning, which is really making space for other ways of seeing, which I think is a nice, succinct way of putting it. So I don't want to be a bystander. Again, another quote from the Talmud: "It is not your duty to finish the work, but neither are you at liberty to neglect it." So it was James Baldwin back in 1984 who said, "Being white means never having to think about it." And for many years, I never did. So I want to say again, I don't have any answers. And I speak from within the problem, as Christina Sharpe would say from her 2016 book, In the Wake. She talks about the ongoing impacts of colonial histories and their enduring effects. So in the training I've been involved in, we certainly are rethinking the curriculum. Psychotherapy is often described as one of the caring professions, but it's also clear that many trainees who present as different from the cultural norm, whether that be race, sexual, gender, or neurological, do not always experience care and inclusion in their trainings. And for me, real decolonisation isn't about rejecting existing theories, as I think some people are fearful of, but it's about rethinking them and widening them to recognise systemic oppression and cultural context. So, for example, attachments has always been on the curriculum, and we used to talk about it in terms of John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth. But actually, you know, when we think about it, there was a book that came out in 2023 by Jennifer Mullen, and she said something which really struck me, which was that she brings in the colonial impact of attachment. And she says terms like insecure attachment can be used to justify racialized trauma by pathologizing individual adaptive responses to systemic racism, while simultaneously overlooking the underlying structural inequities. That really struck me. And again, with the shadow, you know, rather than just talking about Carl Jung, we now say to students, which knowledge systems do you draw from to look at and work with the shadow? It's much more inclusive. So we're recognizing that not everything in our psyche can be reduced to an intrapsychic problem, somehow separate from the culture and the systems of oppression, as some of our inherited theories might suggest. And I realized that I had historically assumed a universality. And I want to talk a little bit about this because social norms infuse my being. And this leads to what could be called a universality, which is a belief that we're all part of the same system. And from a spiritual standpoint, this may be true. And I work in a psychospiritual training, and I've heard this said often, but from a material reality, this universality is not as neutral, inclusive, as an innocent as it may seem. And Erich Fromm was saying this back in the 1940s. You know, and Gail Lewis said, the social conditions in which a self is made and unmade, there is no such thing as a decontextualized client or therapist or individual. So I think there can be an assumption of universality which excludes the lived experiences of many students, and it doesn't equip trainees to work with a diverse population. So I think we need to move beyond window dressing, and that was a phrase I picked up from Feluke Taylor on a listserv that we're both on. Because a diverse curriculum, it is attractive, but it's not enough. My experience is we need to recognize the harms that have been done and continue to be done by assuming an innocent position. And I think reenacting the dynamics that drove the colonizing forces in the first place. And I think it's about ideas of supremacy. Peter Beinart had a quote which I found very impactful. He said, "It is a very human tendency to become accustomed to supremacy, the fear that equality means death." So I took from the paper that I wrote some quotes from a paper that Audre Lorde wrote in 1979, and she warned that superficial change or correct language, which we're going to call the master's tools, cannot truly dismantle systems of oppression, i.e. the master's house. And Ruth Frankenberg asked us to consider how these systems persist internally, despite our intentions or words. And for me, this highlights the risk of bypassing the real work required for transformation. You know, yesterday someone mentioned another meditation for the people of Gaza. And I thought, yeah, we can say the right thing and go to meditations, but for me, that is not going to the heart of the issue. So my paper is really about the book that Michael Rothberg wrote in 2019 called The Implicated Subject, where he talks about shared responsibility. And he says most people are not direct perpetrators, but are still enmeshed in and benefit from historic and systemic forms of inequality. So we have benefited from regimes of domination that extend beyond individual intent or awareness. And as such, we're connected to these injustices, even though we don't feel responsible for them. So it's about moving beyond ideas of victims and perpetrator and acknowledging multiple narratives and responsibilities, because I think this enables a more honest engagement and self-reflection. So what does this look like in psychotherapy trainings? Well, we need to consider that trainings are more accessible to those who can afford high tuition fees and unpaid placements, and who are perhaps already familiar with dominant therapeutic models rooted in Western perspectives. And really, the implicated subject, I think, is particularly relevant for predominantly white and privileged training bodies, of which I'm a part, And a student that I have the permission to share all of this in my paper, she observed that she was weary of taking familiar shapes on the training, having to protect her white peers or tutors from feeling their own forms of ancestral guilt and shame. Of course, we're going to meet defences. I know that. But I think it's not just an individual question, but a collective one. So reflections when it comes to our history, how might we have impacted others? How might we take responsibility for it? And it's, you know, the implicated subject, it's an implication rather than complicity. It becomes, I think, easier to talk about it. And we know that in order to best understand experiences beyond our own, which is a key component of any depth psychotherapy approach, we need to really be open to hearing about another's experience. And I know, and I've met this a lot, the refusal, and some students say they don't wish to bring in the political. But although it may not be acknowledged, the political is always there. It's in the air in which we breathe, whether or not we choose to recognize it. So for some students, bringing in what Fanon called sociogeny, a way of thinking that there's no separation between social and psychic life, brings relief and recognition. So Levinas talked about an ethical attitude of non-indifference. That touched me, it moves me. So briefly, and finishing off, towards decolonial practice, it's an ongoing process in my understanding, and it requires self-reflection, institutional accountability, and the willingness to see learning, and indeed unlearning, as relational and embodied, and not just theoretical. I have the privilege to think about these things. I don't feel responsible for all that's happening in the world, but I've been handed a life where none of it has to matter. And I want to find the courage to stand up to a system that isn't working. And psychotherapy is part of that system. So for me, this requires a faculty and a curriculum that embraces meaningful inclusion. So I find myself questioning some of the orthodoxies and paradigms that I've inherited. It's questioning without necessarily having answers. And really, my paper is about my learning so far. So what does meaningful inclusivity mean? Well, a training process that's infused with all of our understandings and learnings as we begin to include the lived experiences of students from marginalised groups more fully into the training process. And I think tutors teaching the revised curriculum need to be engaging with the painful process of confronting their own implication. And this reminds me to continually examine my role, both consciously and unconsciously, in maintaining colonial dynamics. So what I often do is I send out papers, and I really liked the Lynn Jacobs paper, Learning to Love White Shame and Guilt. It's not enough to send out papers. I learned that I need to engage in dialogue. And I think when trainers in institutes avoid engaging in critical reflection, it can really risk a bypass, a collective bypass for the whole profession. And that is not okay for me. So finally, as a conclusion, what would an inclusive training look like? Well, I think it needs to address both the structural level and the interpersonal level. And so the implicated subject really helped me to reflect on shame and guilt without actually going into a place of collapse. I think it means preparing therapists to work with diverse populations with their lived experience and psychic life. And again, while some may not want to acknowledge the politics of it all, our unconscious has no choice but to be impacted by the world in which we live. I think we need a collective commitment to recognizing the complexities of identity and internalized oppression, and to seeing systemic realities as central to all learning environments. Otherwise, I don't think true transformation can take root. And I want to acknowledge the limits of our current frameworks for this endeavour, and as a profession, continue thinking together about what we might need to do otherwise. Thank you.
Getting my microphone on. Thank you very much. And I didn't jog you because you were fine. I could see. So we've got 5 minutes for questions. And I have to say, I hadn't given thought to how we were going to quite do this. So how are people going to indicate that they want to ask something?
They can put their hand up, I think, is one way. Yeah.
Or
Okay,
they can just break into talk.
Adele, I can see, Anne, you waved your hand. And
I'm waving my hand, yes.
I mean, I can't see everyone on the screen, so I don't know if anyone, whether Jane, you can hold this and let people in, or maybe just people unmute themselves and speak. Maybe that's the
Yeah.
That's the best.
Can I be very quick then? Just thank you very much for starting us off like that. About you and of course Del too. Actually, look, there's so much in what you've said that's really important, and I'm going to need more time and I need to probably read the paper. But one thought that occurred to me whilst listening to you, Del, and listening to you, Adele, was that the whole thing about violence and Fanon. I know that Fanon, lots is said about Fanon and violence. But Fanon wants to say, I think, that colonization is a violence, and a response to the violence is violence. And I think that if you think that racism is a violence, or you think that what was happening in Gaza before now was a violence, you don't sort of jump up and down about the violence that happened in October. So I mean, there's something, isn't there, about one of the first things is about what do we see as violent and what do we fail to see as violent?
Yeah, I really like that. Thank you for framing that. And what do we fail to see as violence? I think that is something that I'd really like to explore with other people on this Zoom conference today, because I think there's a lot of violence that's being perpetrated and not acknowledged as violence, and actually silence in some ways is a violence. Thank you. Yeah, and thank you for who someone put in the chat. Okay. Any other questions, observations, and comments, particularly about what I have said in the last 15 minutes? I'm going to try and read the chat as well, which is always a nice challenge. Violence only counts against certain types of people. Exactly. I think there's something about Olivia Lang was saying, you know, what happens, how we come to value some bodies over other bodies. How does that happen? That is itself is a violence. And Els, yes, silence is a violence. I agree, yeah.
What do you think of the idea that, following on what Anel was saying, that sometimes power's not given, but has to be taken?
Is that to me?
Yes, to you.
Yeah, power's not given. Yeah, I mean, power is interesting, isn't it? And I think that's right. I think it's also for me about recognizing our own implicit power, certainly as a trainer. And I agree, there is something about, I'm thinking about how I sit in the space. I'm going to try and keep it to my personal experience rather than getting too caught in polemics. But yeah, as a trainer, I have a power in that group, and I think I have to use that wisely. And I do need to step in. And I do need to acknowledge my power and recognize that there are some people in a training group, white-bodied people, who are going to have power in that group. And how, as a facilitator, do I, and I'm practicing and studying and trying to learn how best to facilitate a space where there is a lot of power differentials in the space, and what does taking power look like in a psychotherapy training, and who has voices and who doesn't have voices. Thank you. It's a good question. Let me just quickly look in the chat. Orientalism is the violence that promotes the oppressed. The oppressed are the violent. Nada, did you want to unmute yourself and say anything about that?
Hi, good morning, everyone. It's just about Orientalism, which is the Western world and the white supremacist idea of how they continually justifying the notion of that the oppressed people are the violent, the oppressed people are the terrorist.
Yeah.
And that's how they keep justifying colonization, apartheid, racism, ethnic cleansing. And really, in teaching institute, like us as a professional, I think we need to pick these cracks and be very, very rigorous and interrogating because interrogation and disruption is not violence, it's questioning and educating and making people aware of this subtle, unconscious process that promotes the otherwise, just silence people to be themselves. For example, in the case of Palestine, I am a Palestinian practitioner, trainer, and a supervisor. And often we've been promoted to be the terrorist, promoted that we don't exist, we have no voice, we're not the indigenous people of the land, and so on. And that's through the media, institution, the law, international law, as you can all see. And now it's all being exposed, and people just so ambivalent or choose to be to speak into that. And this is such an important, I just wanted to share my mind. I mean, there's so much to say, but thank you for giving me the space to share. So so how is the West have constructed these constructs just to keep silencing us as the oppressed, and we the one who knows the truth. No one knows the truth more than the oppressed.
Nada, thank you very much for bringing your voice here. I very much appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I can see apparently 4 hands, even though I can't see them raised. And I'm Jane, I'm hoping someone's holding the time for the 5 minutes.
Yeah, I think we're pretty much there actually, Adele. So I don't know if you want to have a last comment before we move on to our next speaker.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, someone says, why is intersectionality not included? Is, but I also want to say that intersectionality is like a legal term, and what do we mean? I mean, really what we're trying to address is the fact that there's a multiplicity of experiences in the room, and as Nada was just saying, why is it that some experiences get tended to and listened to and others don't? And it's not just talking about racism, it's hearing from people's experience. And that's why I'm very grateful that the people that have spoken in this first section have been able to share their experiences. So very grateful for that. And thank you everyone for your time. I'll mute now.
Well, thank you again. I think, shall we do another silent thank you?